For the newly established Continental Army, the years leading up to Valley Forge were filled with military disappointments. General George Washington knew his poorly trained troops needed purposed rest and strong discipline. Wayne Bodle states, barely an army at all by European standards, badly mauled in the 2 battles they had fought that year, and crippled by logistical shortcomings, the American troops came to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania for the winter campaign of 1777 to 78. To attain independence from Britain, the Continental Army had to be unified and strengthened. The winter encampment at Valley Forge was critical to the future success of the Army in the Revolutionary War. I am standing among the statues, the memorials, and historical replicas within the hills of Valley Forge. Today, the only sounds heard here are those of curious tourists and local hikers busying about the trails and sites. But over 200 years ago, amongst the shouts of generals and through the booms of rifles and cannons, the martial sounds of drummers and fifers thundered in the air. 4 main areas will be addressed in this presentation. First, the instruments needed to create structure and uniformity among the troops. Second, the leadership of military music. Third, the background on some of the musicians' skill and training. And fourth, the psychological impact music had to promote nationalism. The foundations of American military music are rooted in many European traditions and styles. The primary purpose of military music was to communicate formation, battle orders, and daily routines. Raoul Camus refers to 18th century warfare as an art that had its rules of behavior, etiquette, and intricate maneuvers, of which were dependent on the steady beat and cadence of the drum and fife. In military marches, as defined by historian Raymond Monelle, a drum rhythm was beaten as a command to march, in other words, a signal that brought order and direction, which were especially significant to Scottish, German, French, and British armies in the 18th century. Camus notes that from its infancy, the Continental Army mandated that every regiment consist of at least 1 drummer and 1 fifer. Although the drum and the fife were established within the Army, Washington still struggled to bring regularity, discipline, and order to his extremely inexperienced and rowdy troops. According to Robert Middlekauff, the Army had moved so often in the preceding months that no clear routine had been developed. The formation and execution of musical programs and trainings required ample talent and tremendous organization, a difficult undertaking that General George Washington facilitated with the collaborative services offered by Friedrich William Baron von Steuben and John Howell. Steuben arrived in Valley Forge in February 1778, and he quickly realized a set of policies and drill regulations had to be developed and established. He thus created a manual outlining every procedure and function, which is called the Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States. Chapter 21, entitled Of the Different Drum Beats of the Drum, lists various beats and signals that would communicate marches and orders. One regularly used beat was called the march, and it signaled the whole army to move. Other beats signaled life within the camp, including when to gather wood and water. Because the drum was integral to communicating every order and command, any drummer who practiced outside the practicing hours issued by the general would be punished. However, no formal musical training programs existed until the inauguration of John Howell as the inspector and superintendent of music for the Army in August of 1778. The quality and skill of drummers and fifers was poor, which causes historian Warren Howe to base the belief that the performance of most field musicians were probably dependent on individually acquired abilities and knowledge. Howe's conclusions are supported by the research of Michael Arbrecht, who places most drummers during the Revolutionary War between the ages of 10 and 18. 16 years of age, although young by today's standards, was considered mature in the days of the American Revolution and was the average age of drummers and fifers alike. Despite the natural talents of young musicians, Howell still had to create order and structure within the military's music programs. A large part of Howell's role was to write policy and notate music in books. Most Army regiments lacked the basic supplies of sheet music, which caused inconsistency and disorder among units. Howell's charge was no small feat. The Gauder-Lehrman collections reveal 3 primary documents noting Howell's commitment and excellence to his role as the Army's music director. First, in a letter to Henry Knox, Howell mentions the shortages of drums and fifes and asks for materials to replace damaged instruments so the drummers and fifers could perform their duties properly. The second document lists all the Army musicians by type, location, and status, which indicates Howell's strict organization. And the third document ranked musicians that were fit for duty or needed further training. Howell also supplied a list of needs for the musicians, including drumheads, drumsticks, blank books, and sheet music for the notation. Another primary source indicating the lack of musical materials is given by Nathaniel Brown, a Fife major in the 4th Connecticut Regiment. Brown's manuscript reveals his enlistment on December 13, 1777, and had been a fifer for almost 4 years. He was appointed Fife Major on October 10, 1780, the last of his 4 years. Referring to the lack of supplies, Brown recalls there being no instructions for the fife. Therefore, Brown must have been skilled at his trade, showing enough proficiency in performance and memorization to be promoted as Fife Major. The task of writing and notating music was laborious and time-intensive. Howe states the War of Independence consequently served as a catalyst for music writing, standardized repertoire, instructional methods, and organizational structure for the tactical, ceremonial, and social needs of the Army. Through the collaborative efforts of Stuyvesant and Howell, precision and uniformity in the Continental Army was thus acquired by adapting British drumbeats and signals. Military music was expanded beyond field drummers and fifers into a more elitist group of instruments, which included French horns, bassoons, and clarinets. Bands of music were common for well-established armies like the French, British, and German, but the young American Army had no such thing and desired it greatly. Frank Moore, a soldier in Washington's Continental Army, records the events of the first anniversary of America's independence. In addition to drummers and fifers, Moore mentions the Hessian Band of Music, taken in Trenton on December 26, 1776, that had attended and heightened the festivity with some fine performances suited to the joyous occasion. His reference to the Hessian Band of Music emphasizes the value of music within the military social culture. Interestingly, John Howell would be appointed as the inspector and superintendent of music for the Army only weeks after Moore's recorded events. Certainly, the musical bands of the enemy camps inspired American armies to enhance and better equip their musicians with meticulous training and technical expertise. Later in his written account, Moore states, "After dinner, a number of toasts were drank, all breathing independence and a generous love of liberty and commemorating the memories of those brave patriots who fell gloriously in defense of freedom and the righteous cause of their country. Each toast was followed by a discharge of artillery and small arms and a suitable piece of music by the Hessian Band." Twice, Moore mentions the Hessian Band, indicating the rarity of such fine music enjoyed by the military men, something they desired to implement within their own regiments. Once the musical bands were established, they were in high demand, and according to Raoul Camus, were engaged and paid by the officers and were separate from the company fifers and drummers. Research by Simon Anderson shows the functions and duties of elite musical bands, which included political affairs, personal entertainment, funerals, executions, informal dinners, recruiting activities, parades, and large-scale movement marches. Although the drum and fife were simple instruments and not as glamorous as the instruments played in military bands, they were integral to the function and pride of the Army. James Clark states, "The drum and fife provided the rough and ready music that accompanied the private soldier, with the pack on his back, a musket on his shoulder, and a bayonet at his side. They were prepared to create mayhem in order to drive out the soldiers of an empire he had never asked to join, whose capital he would never see, and whose class system made no sense in the New World. These drummers and fifers were just as passionate as any freedom-fighting soldier. One of the rough and ready musical pieces drummers and fifers often played throughout the War of Independence was Yankee Doodle. Interestingly, both the British and the Americans used this song as a way to disrespect the other. To the British, the colonists were ill-equipped bumpkins, but the Americans, when in victory, played it to mock the British sense of superiority. Clark states, as the British marched toward Lexington Green on the morning of April 19, 1775, their fifes and drums reportedly played Yankee Doodle to mock the Americans. And as they trailed back to Boston in defeat later that day, they reported the Americans played Yankee Doodle right back at them. Although the drums and the fife played a non-combatant role, they were powerful weapons that stirred nationalism and pride. Drums especially spoke a language of war, power, and celebration that transcended into the ears of soldiers and civilians alike. Being the backbeat of war, drums struck a note of authority and embodied a declaration of wealth and power. Drums signaled an intensity of nationalistic spirit that could stimulate, depending on the ears it befell, hope and bravery or anger and fear. Christopher March states, just as the soldier learned to heed the signals beaten out by the military drummer, so the civilian developed the ability to interpret the rhythms that cut through the air in the town and village. The difficulties and successes in building the Continental Army are revealed through the explorations of military music. Music was essential for marching cadences and signals, as well as its effectiveness in ceremonial events and building morale among colonial troops and civilians. These instruments of warfare contributed an important layer of cultural meaning that deserves our attention. Drummers and fifers were crucial in filling the cultural and martial atmospheres with the rumblings and roarings of the Revolution.